Great to see everybody here while you're getting donuts, etc. I'll introduce Jason. Our speaker this morning is Jason Marsh, Executive Director of the Greater Good Science Center. Tall guy. What else, Jason? I have a whole bio here for Jason. So first is Jason is the manager of his City of Berkeley softball team. So good job by you, Jason. Very important. They were second place last season, you guys. He is somebody who went to grad school for documentary filmmaking. He likes reading. He likes watching movies. These are all things I asked him, like, tell me some stuff about yourself so that I can make an actually fun introduction. Before he was at Greater Good, he was helping run a publication called Responsive Community in Berkeley. He worked for KQED. And when did you get to Greater Good? 15 years ago? 20 years ago? 23 years ago. So he's had a long tenure helping shepherd really the growth of one of our core partners for both researching and disseminating information about the virtues, among other things. So Greater Good has a very popular website. They have newsletters that reach hundreds of thousands of people. They have wide reach among specific vocational communities, educators, health practitioners. They have a very successful podcast, The Science of Happiness. And Jason has been a great partner for me here at JTF. So about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, Jason and I started talking about an idea for how can we promote the concept of intellectual humility in culture more broadly. And through the good auspices of the smart people at Greater Good, including Jason, they came up with an idea of how let's do content, let's do subgranting, let's do a number of other things. So we tried an iteration of that and it worked really well. It worked so well that we decided to roll it out again for version 2, which is about love, which is active right now. So Jason's going to share with us this morning about the lessons they've learned about promoting concepts that are central to the mission of the foundation: humility, love, generosity, gratitude, but especially those two among culture broadly and then in specific audiences. So welcome, Jason Marsh.
Thanks, John. Thank you all so much for hosting me. Thank you, Christina, for making this such an easy visit. We have been partners with JTF for many years now, been incredibly grateful for the partnership, has enabled us to do really gratifying work. And so I'm really pleased to be able to be with you to share some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years that John was alluding to. Before I get started, I'm always curious to ask, how many of you had heard of the Greater Good Science Center before today? 97%, that's pretty good. Great, so then John already shared a lot about what we do. I'm gonna just gloss over the basics. Based at UC Berkeley, we cover what we call the science of a meaningful life, translate that science into terms and resources that make the science accessible and practical to people outside of academia through our online magazine, Greater Good, our Science of Happiness podcast, events and workshops, professional development, online courses. And so the work is really about translating the research, making it more accessible to wider audiences, but we really focus our work we think of it really not just as offering ongoing coverage of the science and doing science reporting. We really are intentional about trying to shape big cultural conversations in a few ways. And I think about those ways as really having a what, a why, and a how. I'm a journalist, so basically I think about everything in terms of what, why, and how. But for the work we do at Greater Good, the what is really about human nature. We try to challenge dominant cultural narratives about what it means to be human, about what human nature is, countering the idea that human nature, human behavior is fundamentally, inherently selfish, aggressive, belligerent, and we try to offer this other narrative of human nature and human development, human evolution, really emphasizing our deep propensity for compassion and caregiving and pro-social as opposed to antisocial behavior. So we try to really advance this other view of what it means to be human. And then there's a big why for us. There's why does this matter? We try to make the case for the importance of character virtues like gratitude and forgiveness, especially relational virtues that have to do with pro-social behavior and social connection, really to draw on the research to identify the deep personal benefits, relational benefits, and societal benefits of practicing character virtues. And then finally, we try to really shape the conversation about about the pathways to a meaningful life, what it really means to find true happiness in life, and debunk a lot of myths and misconceptions about what will bring people happiness, and what it takes to truly live a meaningful life. So it was with a lot of this thinking in mind that it really shaped the conversations we were having with John and internally a few years ago in conversations about, for starters, intellectual humility, about how can we take emerging scholarship on timely character virtues and really try to infuse them into our culture in a meaningful way that had deep impact on people's consciousness. And so we developed the idea in consultation with John and with my colleagues at GGSC for two projects that I'm going to elaborate on today. One on expanding awareness of the science of intellectual humility, another on spreading love through the media. Love and intellectual humility being two timeless virtues, but for us, they both felt especially timely because both of them really have to do with, they're both virtues that help us bridge differences of perspective, experience, helping to transcend divides and partisan conflicts in our politics, in our society today. And this really dovetailed with the project we've been running at GGSC on Bridging Differences, trying to take lessons from social science and really try to use them to extract and distill key skills and strategies that can help people foster more constructive dialogue and relationships and understanding across lines of difference. And so we saw intellectual humility and love as being really key virtues for the GGSC worldview, but also really speaking to the moment today and really offering strategies and hope for the possibility of overcoming divides. And so for that work, motivated by a lot of that thinking, both of these projects really had three overarching goals. First and foremost, we were looking to increase the amount of media coverage in total of the science and experience of particular character virtues from a variety of angles for a wide range of publications and for a diversity of audiences. We also were looking in the process to deepen the public's understanding and appreciation of certain character virtues and highlight their contemporary relevance to different areas of life, and also for people really help them appreciate their own capacity to practice these virtues, their own capacity for love and for demonstrating intellectual humility at a time when a lot of cultural forces are pushing them perhaps in the opposite direction. And finally, for longer term impact, to build a sustained network of media producers and researchers working together who were committed to sustained, thoughtful, ongoing exploration of character virtues. So how do we do this? I'm going to walk through first how we tried to translate those goals into action on the Intellectual Humility Project. This project ran from 2021 to 2024, already has results and more lessons learned that I'm going to share as well. Love is still in progress, so I'm going to share a bit about that project as well. But first and foremost, I'm going to share what we did for intellectual humility, what we found, and why we think it matters. So first, just very briefly, I'm not going to go that deep into the actual substance of the science of intellectual humility, but just to say our working definition for the project was intellectual humility, meaning the degree to which people recognize their beliefs might be wrong, drawing on research, a definition offered by Duke psychologist Mark Leary and his colleagues, really centering on recognizing limitations of one's own beliefs, acknowledging and accepting those limitations without defensiveness or feeling threatened, and finally being open to other people's views and appreciating their intellectual strengths. So this is really the key components of intellectual humility we tried to advance through the project. There were other nuances we covered as well, but a lot of it really boils down to those components. For us, it felt especially timely to focus on intellectual humility, not only because of what we saw as its contemporary cultural and even political relevance, but also because there had been, thanks to many investments by JTF, a huge growth in the science of intellectual humility over the previous decade. I think there were, in the 5 years before we launched the project, 3 times as many studies published on intellectual humility as over the previous 20 years before that. And so we felt like the time was really right for us to try to share with folks what that science had generated to date about intellectual humility and raise some of the big questions the science was raising as well about how intellectual humility can be practiced, its limitations, as well as its potential applications. And so we did that through a variety of activities. First, we produced through the GGSC just some foundational content. We established core themes and covered some key scientific concepts that we felt like were most important. We wanted to make sure really got out into the culture. And that included articles we published for our Greater Good online magazine, videos like this one on 3 ways to encourage intellectual humility in kids, episodes of our Science of Happiness podcast, like this one on a physician who was trying to practice more intellectual humility in his relationships with his patients. And then articles we wrote for other platforms as well, like this piece we wrote for Washington Post on the power in telling your children, I don't know. But then also worked for produced pieces for other publications as well, like Edutopia and others. But then in terms of those partnerships, a lot of the work also focused on seeding media on other platforms. So a lot of the grant that we received from JTF was for us to provide sub-grants to other media outlets, other media producers. We wound up receiving 150 proposals that resulted in 19 grants to nonfiction media producers, individuals, organizations. Then we paired them with a scientific advisor to carry out their projects over an 18-month period. Those projects ultimately generated 104 pieces for various media, especially majority of those pieces for radio or podcasts, which was a heavy focus for us feeling at the time, especially there had been a big growth in podcasting, strong distribution that a lot of those podcasters had, more so than a lot of the video proposals we received at the time. Fewer pieces that were written for print or for online publications, some videos, and a couple of events and a big museum exhibit as well. So this was more than twice the number of pieces we had originally anticipated or hoped for that would be generated by those grants. And so part of what I will be walking through today is why these grants were so much more generative than we had actually anticipated. Finally, big component of the project was also network building. Was pairing those researchers with the projects, bringing them all together with other media folks and other researchers as well for 2 convenings that bookended the project, one at the beginning, one at the end. And then in between, we held a series of Zoom calls for them to work together, strengthen one another's projects, help develop new ideas, and really form a network of folks who are trying to aid one another in both developing the content and also even helping with distribution of that content. So to give a better sense, that's the broad kind of dry overview, to give a better sense of what we actually produced. It's a short video that gives a sense of some of the pieces. You can see and hear a little bit of what those grants and what our work generated and how some of these pieces actually fit together.
Intellectual humility is being humble about what you know and being willing to admit that your beliefs may be wrong.
Welcome, if you are just joining us this morning, to dive even deeper into the science and practice of intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility is a particular kind of humility, and it's a particular kind of humility around beliefs, ideas, and worldviews.
Even though we might think that we know everything, ultimately we don't, right? And we fundamentally have to become comfortable with that realization that our lives are just a process of knowing that is incomplete.
Hi there, my name is Brooke Siebold, and I'm thrilled to present I Changed My Mind. I wanted to create this series because I'm interested in normalizing what the changing mind looks like, because so many of us have changed our minds around issues of major significance. And frankly, we can learn a lot from each other.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Braver Angels podcast. Now, in the last several months, I've been traveling the country, talking to people about how to bridge divides in their own lives, how they can try it, how it works, why they ought to really consider it, even where it feels really, really hard.
Welcome to Kelly Corrigan Wonders. I'm Kelly Corrigan, and this week I'm wondering how the ways we typically think and learn and come to conclusions might be getting in the way of our ability to make more refined and considered choices.
We're back again with Left, Right, and Center. We're featuring audio essays focusing on the concept of intellectual humility. It's knowing that you don't know everything. It's being open-minded. It's listening. It's observing, which I love, which is very much the fabric of our show.
I inserted myself in the middle of a controversial culture wars issue to try to change minds. Things that feel more divisive than ever. Every issue is reduced to a war, and it seems people aren't willing to consider changing their minds.
I'm excited to be here with Daryl Van Tongeren and Sari Martin Concepcion talking about knowing what we don't know, or not knowing what we don't know, as the case may be, also known as intellectual humility.
When an educator shows intellectual humility, they've taken a moment to step back from a previous belief or practice in order to learn more about what they may not know.
Matt, today we're continuing our collaboration with the Greater Good Science Center and exploring this concept of intellectual humility. We wanted to take a moment to think about intellectual humility in the context of all 7 books.
I report the limits of my work for me. I think that is the responsible way to do science. But that stands out to people, and they're like, wait a minute, why would you be pointing out the flaws in your own work, Brandon? Is that imposter syndrome? No, it's not imposter syndrome. It's me being a responsible scientist.
We always have to be ready to change our minds. Yes, we can. Sí se puede.
For all of that content, all those pieces, we saw it really as forming an ecosystem that really added up to more than just the sum of its parts. So first, as I mentioned, we had the content from Greater Good, which proved to be foundational. We produced content that we not only saw as establishing core themes, covering key concepts from the science that we thought were really essential to get out to the public, but also that we fed pretty directly to the other journalists interested in the project. So we, during even the RFP process for the grants, produced pieces and resource pages covering key findings from the science, putting it into practical terms that we offered to the journalists who were just getting acquainted with the topic and the science. And that helped to inform the grant proposals. And then ultimately also was material that we shared with the grantees to get them oriented and started in their work and their exploration of intellectual humility. Then, of course, we brought those grantees with researchers and other media folks together for the 2 convenings, which really had a reciprocal function. They both were opportunities for the grantees to share their work and really help set the agenda for those events. But those events really proved influential in informing and shaping and improving the pieces that those grants were intended to fund in ways that that even exceeded our expectations, which I'll talk a bit about soon. And then, of course, those events also then fed into and sparked new ideas for the content we produced for Greater Good, and the whole cycle proceeded over again. And so with all of that work, all those pieces fitting together, what that netted for us was about a total of 1.5 million views, downloads of content we produced and counting, another 1.5 million views of Greater Good newsletters featuring intellectual humility content, about 6 million views or downloads of content produced by the grantees. And then those figures don't include the other syndication of content, especially Greater Good content. All of the pieces were syndicated on Apple News. We found that some of the pieces on intellectual humility, when they went on Apple News, were the most popular Greater Good pieces on Apple News for that week. And then additional views on our other partners' platforms like Washington Post, Education Week, Edutopia, for which we don't have data. So that was the immediate outputs and reach of a lot of that content. But what was perhaps most gratifying about the project, and probably most exceeded our expectations, were some of the broader ripple effects, ways that the project generated additional content, material, got out into public consciousness in ways that we hadn't even quite anticipated, or at least exceeded a lot of our expectations. So first, we found that the grantees actually generated additional content beyond what they actually had been received, what they'd been funded to produce. Secondly, a lot of non-grantees, folks who did not receive a grant at all, also got in the mix and produced content on intellectual humility. And then finally, a lot of those producers and other researchers involved in the project served as ambassadors for the concept of intellectual humility and became kind of intellectual humility mavens out in the culture, and helped to form a network that really provided for sustained, expanded, and deep content on intellectual humility over time. So there were these ripple effects and downstream results of the project that we hadn't quite anticipated, but I'm going to walk through briefly what this looked like and then why we think the project was so generative in these ways. First off, so the grantees did tremendous work. The projects that we funded probably exceeded our expectations, but then there were these other pieces that they produced that we hadn't even funded them for and that we hadn't anticipated. So for instance, Courtney Martin, who is a freelance journalist, wrote the article for the Christian Science Monitor on ways intellectual humility helped to diffuse culture wars in one school district in Ohio. That piece was featured prominently by the Monitor, but also Courtney is the host of Slate's How To podcast, and she wound up working the concept of intellectual humility into episodes of the podcast that she wasn't funded for. And similarly, she has a popular Substack, The Examined Family, and wrote a short series on intellectual humility for her Substack as well. Michael Shapiro, in addition to the piece he was funded for, wrote this piece for the Saturday Evening Post on ways travel can make us humble. That piece actually, after he wrote it, he got a note from Senator Cory Booker proposing that they collaborate on an op-ed, which I think to date has not come to fruition, but was just evidence of this idea actually getting out and getting out into the culture and reaching influencers in surprising ways. And then Kelly Corrigan, who produced a series on intellectual humility for her radio show and podcast. She also hosts a TV show. So those were just a few of the ways that the grantees really ran with the idea and found other ways, other media that they could permeate with the idea of intellectual humility. And then there were non-grantees who got involved in the project, which was not something we anticipated, certainly not to this extent. Several of these folks we invited to come to the first convening. They were attracted to the idea. They went out a little bit on a whim to come join us. One of those folks was Elizabeth Rich, who's the opinion editor of Education Week, came out of the convening so inspired, without actually receiving funding, developed this series for Education Week, a video series of educators and school leaders who were talking about a time when they had changed their mind about an issue of real importance to them in education. It was called I Used to Think, and they talked about something they used to think in education, and then this new conclusion that they reached. Elizabeth also then worked with us. We collaborated with Tennille Porter, a leading intellectual humility researcher, to develop an essay on intellectual humility for Education Week, which went over well there, to the point where Elizabeth was then inspired to develop a few other pieces by Tennille and others on intellectual humility and its implications for schools and education. And then they wound up collecting these pieces in a broader package. They themselves undertook this survey of a nationally representative sample of educators and school leaders in the US and adapted an intellectual humility scientific scale and gave them a quiz on intellectual humility, found that teachers scored a 78 out of 110 on intellectual humility, which was okay. And they packaged this finding and all those other pieces in a bigger project on addressing and upending polarization in K-12 education that largely centered on intellectual humility, with multiple pieces focusing on intellectual humility as a way of addressing polarization and division in schools, that featured work by Tennille and Monica Guzman, who was another grantee. So that was one effect of non-grantees. Also, Nadia Bolz-Weber, who many of you may know, is a Lutheran pastor, public theologian, best-selling author, attended our first convening, was inspired to produce a couple of pieces for her Substack on intellectual humility. Chris Duffy, who's a comedian, host, heads How to Be a Better Human podcast, came out of that convening, and within a month had Monica on his show for an episode on how to have curious conversations in dangerously divided times. and then reported back that he was trying to work the idea of intellectual humility into multiple episodes of How to Be a Better Human. It's the way that he developed questions for the podcast as well. And this also speaks to this other ripple effect of the project, the ways that grantees like Monica really became ambassadors for the concept. So after that interview, Monica also did an interview with Eboo Patel for his Interfaith America podcast on humility as a key ingredient for bridge building, for reducing polarization. That interview was then picked up and adapted by Deseret News, turned into an article on why we need intellectual humility in an age of polarization, with Monica really being sort of an evangelist and for intellectual humility. Similarly, Kelly Corrigan, another big evangelist, not only did her radio show and podcast and TV show at the Nantucket Project 2023, 2 years ago. She gave the opening keynote talk and framed the whole thing around intellectual humility. I was actually in the audience. I didn't know she was going to do this, but she invoked the term, made this whole event, which was really supposed to be about the importance of pluralism and reducing polarization, kicked it off by focusing it on intellectual humility to this room of influential folks. And finally, also KQED Public Radio was so taken with their work on intellectual humility, they hosted an event that they weren't funded for parents and educators in the San Francisco Bay Area for them to educate about intellectual humility and its benefits for kids and families. So across this work, what we found, I won't go through all these quotes, but folks reported back to us, a lot of the grantees, that they were really struck by the concept, internalized it really deeply to the extent that it influenced many other aspects of their work beyond just the pieces that they produced, even some non-professional pursuits. Bruce Grierson, who wrote that piece I was up before in Psychology Today, he is also part of the lay ministerial team at his Unitarian Church in Canada. He reported back, I mentioned intellectual humility so often that from the pulpit, people are starting to get annoyed. So one of the many ways that folks were finding other applications and other uses for the term and applications of it in their work and in their lives. And then, of course, there were these other non-grantees who were swept up in it as well. Elizabeth Rich from Education Week, that's Tracy Marks, who has a popular YouTube channel where she does videos on psychology and neuroscience. Chris Duffy, comedian and How to Be a Better Human podcast. All of them came to the first event with others as well. Were so excited about the project, they wound up joining the email list that we had created for all the grantees and became part of the ongoing conversation about the projects, and then also joined the ongoing Zoom conversations that we had for the project stakeholders, and then just became active members of the extended community, even though they weren't funded to do so, and became, in all their cases, proponents of the term and incorporated it into their media too. And then there were the researchers who also gave additional legs to the project in ways that they were equipped and empowered and motivated to talk in public media, in other popular media, about their research and about the concept. So Daryl Van Tongeren of Hope College was interviewed by many different outlets, including some of our grantees. The You Have Permission podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, Kelly Corrigan's podcast. He wrote a piece for the conversation. Similarly, Tennille wrote those pieces for Education Week, was interviewed by several different podcasts and articles, and wrote a piece on her own as well. So what all those pieces and others added up to was we saw a real explosion in coverage of intellectual humility. When we looked in the media database Muckrack, and we looked at from the year before we launched the project to the year after, we saw more than a fourfold increase in popular media, non-academic pieces that use the term intellectual humility. It includes articles, videos, podcast episodes, blog posts. Went from about 800 pieces in the year before we launched the project to about 3,500 in the year after we launched the project. That lower red line is verified outlets. So Muckrack will verify established professional journalists. So not just anyone writing on their blog, but more established outlets. Found even there was about a threefold increase from 500 pieces the year before to about 1,500 in the year after. We, of course, can't take credit for all of this growth. There are probably other trends that helped to inspire the project to begin with that were contributing here as well, but it was definitely gratifying to really see this correlation and feel like our work perhaps played some role in fueling this growth over time. So why did this happen? What was sort of the story and the reasons why the project was so much more generative, produced more content than we had even anticipated? We have many different ideas about what's behind some of the success and outputs, but I'm going to share 5 pretty briefly that have been most salient to us. First off was the important role of the community itself in ways that we even underestimated. What we found was that really the grantees came for the funding. That was the motivation, that was the incentive. They came to the event for learning, but they really stayed and got more engaged for the community. It really encouraged for them. We found a deeper emotional and ongoing intellectual investment in the topic and the project. After the project was over, we got many quotes like this one in our final survey of the grantees, where they said most valuable for them was being part of a diverse community of writers, academics, and others curious about the concept. So they singled out the community as being the most valuable piece of the project. One shared, "I've come away from every Zoom feeling energized," which no one ever says, but was just telling, I think, for them, the way that they fed off the energy of the group in those Zooms as well as in person. This was true for the non-grantees as well. When they came to the event, a lot of them were intrigued by the term. They were excited about the opportunity to learn from leading researchers of intellectual humility. But again, what really sucked them in was the community. It was how they forged a deeper connection to the project. This was Elizabeth from Education Week sharing. She felt like not only is the concept worthy of future exploration, but so are the many relationships that we made over the course of the days together. And then very practically, the events helped to forge specific collaborations between folks who attended. It was just the ways they met each other, learned about their work, and then went on. For instance, Daryl and Tennille and many of the other researchers had the opportunity to share their work on many different podcasts and many different articles because they met a lot of those producers at the event, forged personal connections with them, which then manifested later in their appearance on their shows. Similarly, folks identified collaborators like the connection Monica and Chris made, where she appeared on his podcast shortly after the event because of the bond they struck up at the event itself. So community was really key. Also found that practicing the virtue was arguably as important as reporting on it. So this was something we helped to engineer. At the first convening, we brought in journalists Amanda Ripley and Helene Buonadutti-Hoffer, who had a company called Good Conflict that offers trainings to journalists. And they customized a training on intellectual humility that centered on techniques of listening, checking assumptions, looking for different perspectives, really offering ways people can report with intellectual humility, not just on it. And this really struck a chord among the grantees and surfaced, was really live for them at the event. And then afterwards as well, introduced certain techniques and certain themes that they kept coming back to the point where when the project was over, this is Beth Daly, who's executive editor of The Conversation. She shared she had internalized all of this work so deeply and these processes and techniques so deeply that they were even part of her daily personal life when talking to others. I challenge myself when I'm so sure I'm right to see things a different way. When talking to staff, especially around story ideas and framing, I ask them to have empathy and think through what other perspectives might be, whether they agree with them or not. I believe this has led to more nuanced pieces, and some pieces editors do not personally agree with. I call that a win, and so would we. We also were gratified to see at the end of the project, or really somewhat surprised to see, we did a follow-up survey of the grantees 18 months later, and we asked them, how committed do you still feel to reporting on the topic of intellectual humility? And 5 is extremely committed, so a majority of them still said they were extremely committed. But then we asked them, how committed do you still feel to reporting with intellectual humility? And there it was almost unanimous. So there was, in ways that we were surprised, and actually they were surprised as well, because right after the project, the data was more evenly balanced. They internalized the ethos of intellectual humility, incorporated it into their identity as journalists, even more than they were wedded to the idea of reporting on it over time. Third, the benefits for researchers arguably almost as great as those for the grantees. So for the first convening, we brought in Jamie Ryerson of the New York Times, who has a workshop he's developed that JTF has supported called Beyond the Ivory Tower, where he trains academics to write about their work for non-academic audiences. Jamie led a condensed version of that workshop for the researchers of intellectual humility who were at the event. And they learned from Jamie. And then also over time, we did an online media training as well that they also participated in, benefited from, and learned. It was really like teach a researcher to fish. It was really them learning how to report on their work, talk about their work, so they weren't just reliant on the journalists themselves to report on their work. So this was key, and this was something that a lot of the researchers appreciated. And this is a quote from Daryl talking about the project helped him realize we really should be thinking about the public application of our work from the beginning. And clearly evident in the way that a lot of the researchers helped to get the word out about their work in the interviews they did and the pieces that they wrote, and served as other ways of evangelizing for IH, and also for making sure that their research got out in accurate and clear ways to the public. Also quickly, we really found it was important to have a balanced investment of individuals and institutions. So there were a lot of great, creative, individual freelance journalists that we invested in, Kelly Corrigan, Michael Shapiro, Courtney Martin, who really found innovative ways of getting the word out about intellectual humility, and really ran with the concepts in ways that we hadn't even fully anticipated, found new ways and new platforms to write for, to talk about the concept on as well. But it also came with some risks. A few of their pieces actually didn't pan out. Some of them, they thought they had distribution. The distribution fell through. So there were some trade-offs with them. There was opportunities for greater reward and production that we hadn't even anticipated, but also some risks that we balanced with investments in institutions like The Conversation, JSTOR Daily, Scientific American, where that produced pieces that were more reliable and predictable, did not have the same room for growth and for reaching other platforms as well that we hadn't anticipated, but ensured that there was at least a strong baseline of content that a lot of these innovators and creatives could really build on. And then learning about the science was inspiring for the group, but only to a point. So for a lot of the folks who attended the first convening, they were really excited to dive into the research. The opening presentations by a group of scientists like Aranda and Tennille really energized a lot of the discussion, informed a lot of the pieces and conversation at the convening and beyond. But then after that, we had a Zoom call. The plan was to have a new presentation by a different researcher in every subsequent Zoom call. After the first call, where Elizabeth Mancuso presented some of her research, we got feedback from the grantees saying, okay, this is enough. Like we are reaching a point of diminishing returns with the research. It has been really helpful for us to get oriented, to get inspired. And now we just want to zero in on developing our pieces and using this time to work with one another. So it was key for us to really plant the seeds and infuse the science into their work, but also then to leave them time to sort of marinate in that science and develop their pieces amongst themselves with input from researchers, but not be as fully immersed in the research. So a lot of those lessons now have informed the development and execution of our Love project. Really, a lot of this project, which I'll just cover really briefly, is really animated by the idea of not only helping to expand people's understanding of their own capacity for love, but also seeing love not strictly in romantic terms, seeing it as a deep, unselfish commitment to serve, promote, nurture another person's well-being, even to put their interests before your own, extending well beyond romantic love to include compassionate love, companionate love, love of humanity. And so that has been really the ideas of love that have really animated the project. A lot of the activities have been the same, but there have been some new additions here. For one, there was co-funding attached to this project. Acton Family Giving and unlikely collaborators made investments that enabled us to give out more grants, 23 as opposed to 19, with a stronger focus on social media, which was something of an oversight. I think first time around, we invested in some video projects that really struggled with distribution, whereas the one YouTube project that we supported in intellectual humility reached a large audience of tens of thousands, at least, of viewers for their YouTube channel. And so this time around, we have invested in 5 social media projects. And that has been so far really exciting because they also are reaching very different audiences, have very different followers through mostly YouTube and TikTok. And we're also producing a radio special on love, have a second convening planned from the start. We actually, for intellectual humility, had only planned for one kickoff convening. Somehow, Greater Good Science Center were heavily focused on social connection and cooperation and community, but we had underestimated the importance of connection and community for this cohort. But by popular demand, we had a second meeting, thanks to JTF being willing to provide supplemental funding to bring all of our grantees and others back together. And then we're doing a big public event to bring together not just the grantees, but also members of the public and other thought leaders for a bigger discussion of love in the final year of the project. So to put in perspective, for the Love Project, originally we had aimed to have at least 60 proposals for intellectual humility. We received 150. For Love, we received more than 1,300. So I think 1,334, which we were both excited about, slightly overwhelmed by. Our team spent a lot of time reading a lot of very great proposals, and ultimately we're able to award grants to 23 of them. And that included audio pieces, print pieces, some social media pieces, including a grant to USA Today to do a new video and podcast series on exploring different forms of love. Jason Marsh, YouTuber, on a series on the neuroscience of love. Religion News Service doing a series on how love can be understood through religion and cultivated between strangers for a podcast series. And then a lot of that work, the grant making, the success of the RFP attracted some media coverage. So Inside Philanthropy wrote an article about it in August, and then Neiman Reports invited my colleague Catherine Lewis, who was running the RFP, to write a piece about what she learned from reading more than 1,300 grant applications on love as well. And so it's been really gratifying to see this model and this work really continue to grow and expand and take off in the interest that we've seen in the Love Project, which we attribute to just the deeper network that we established through intellectual humility. We just refined our outreach network, our promotion channels, and then including through the grantees as well, who helped to get the word out. Also just the greater accessibility and relevance, I think, of the concept and term of love, and also just part of the zeitgeist. I think a lot of people are really hungry to talk about love at a time where they felt like they were living in a culture short of love. And also, this RFP was open at a time when a lot of those applicants were either facing or anticipating cuts to funding and were really hungry for any funding for $5,000 to $50,000 that they could receive. So all of that contributed to those many grant applications that we've been making sense of and reporting on, and also now our 23 grantees who've started to come together and already gelling in ways that we think bode well for the rest of the project. This is Meredith Goldstein, who's the host of the Love Letters podcast for the Boston Globe. After we had our kickoff call a few weeks ago, she shared afterwards, she said, "I haven't been in this good of a mood in a long time." So we felt like it was a good sign that this cohort will be as elevated and bond as much, hopefully, as the intellectual humility cohort did as well, and hopefully pay the same dividends over time. All of this work on intellectual humility and love and other projects we've been running at GGSC over the years as well would not be possible without the great support and trust of JTF. So we are incredibly grateful for your support, both of the work that we do and also of the science that we cover. That's really the lifeblood of our work. So making all of that possible has been incredibly gratifying for us, and we are enormously grateful for all of your work and all of your support, and for enabling us really to help that science reach an even bigger audience over time.